Welcome. Today I'll be presenting on my findings on growth strategies in developing human capital, incorporating these empirical studies across the factors of health, education, and migration. So I think most of us would agree that human capital is a key contributor towards economic growth through driving labor productivity and innovation. And we know that health, education, and work experience are key pillars of this. But of the wide bodies of research out there, there's not many which actually examine the interactions between health, education, and migration. And for those that do, they normally only confine it to a specific country or specific region without like wider considerations for the social economic or geographical circumstances. So this research aims to incorporate the raw findings across this to propose a more general strategy. So first, when we look at health interventions, so we actually found out that by targeting health interventions, such as like nourishment pills in India, or treating children for deworming treatment in Kenya, they actually have much better returns to education as compared to traditional education-oriented interventions, such as like introduction of computers or tutoring services or cash transfer. So actually, this shows that there's strong interaction between both health and education. And that's something that is definitely going to be overlooked if one only looks at them in silos when considering the health and education as separate ministries. And further studies have also been done on school feeding programs, which actually show over here that the costs far outweigh the benefits in the long term. So there is definitely room for considering this in the developing world, which policymakers can actually choose to prioritize health education as a means of improving educational outcomes rather than sticking to the traditional education-based interventions that developed countries use. So next, now we also see that education also directly improves health because education, or at least the basic levels, not only do they boost labor productivity by improving literacy and arithmetic skills, but some level of basic education also dramatically decreases fertility rates, which means that capital dilution effects, which are detrimental to long-term growth, will actually be diminished. So on that, we can see again that once again, there are cross interactions between both of these factors. And instead of promoting contraceptives, it might actually be worthwhile to invest more in education in order to reduce fertility rates. So we can see that some targeted interventions in both areas are actually somewhat counterintuitive, but they yield much greater impacts. Also, some more recent literature on returns of education show that it might not be having a decreasing returns to scale as what was previously proposed, but in fact, the returns are U-shaped. This actually can support further investment for tertiary education for the most developed countries in the OECD or the major emerging markets, because the world is increasingly going towards a knowledge-based economy, and this was something that was not the case where such empirical studies were done in the past. So, contrary to previous notions that primary and secondary education actually produce the most bang for your buck, the empirical evidence shows that actually right now, tertiary education is the most lucrative for both OECD and major emerging markets. So that is something to consider when these countries are designing education policies or allocating budgets. So finally, one very short point on migration is that there's always this narrative of a brain drain. So we wanted to see how prevalent it is. And indeed, for most developing countries, they actually lose out in terms of both human capital and long-term economic growth when they start to train many skilled workers or invest too heavily in higher education, but there are insufficient high-paid jobs within their domestic economies. So this is effectively subsidizing human capital accumulation for the developed countries and not benefiting you. In fact, it's wasting money. It will be better spent on primary and secondary education at the earlier stages, while the economy is still not that high up the value chain. And only after one can provide higher paid jobs does one actually venture into investing more in tertiary education? So to summarize all these findings, because there are strong interactions between health, education, and migration, sometimes the optimal policy interventions can become quite counterintuitive. For example, one wouldn't really expect that providing nutrition pills or deworming services in schools actually have higher returns on education as compared to conditional cash transfers or tutoring services, etc. And conversely, one wouldn't expect that providing basic education actually reduces population growth rate by more than contraceptives. So there is room for studying the interaction across these variables instead of considering them in silos just because of how ministries tend to be segregated. Also, it's important to note that effective strategies are very dependent on a country's socio-economic or geographical circumstances. So important to follow empirical evidence on countries which are of similar scenarios as your own. So for example, all the feeding and deworming programs may be very effective in developing countries, but they might not be as effective in a developed country like maybe Singapore, South Korea, or the UK, where hunger and disease are not as prevalent. So the returns will probably be nowhere as huge. And it might be worth sticking to conventional measures such as IT because these are more prominent learning tools nowadays, especially in developed countries. And finally, growth drivers will change over time. So do note that these findings only appeal to the present moment. For example, in the past, we used to think that the returns to education are decreasing as one has more education inputs. But right now, that is not really the case because most of the value generated, i.e., the value that is driving economies forward in this world today, are more knowledge-based, and therefore there is greater returns to tertiary education now. But might this always be the way in the future? Nobody can really tell. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.